I'd like to, besides welcoming you all to this event that is organized by the Program for Law and Society in the Muslim World, to thank also our co-sponsors who are with us here today, the International Human Rights Clinic, the Human Rights Program, HLS Advocates for Human Rights, Musawa, and Equality Now. Thank you to everyone joining us here today in Harvard, from the Harvard Law community, but also those who are tuning in on Facebook from around the world. A warm welcome to everyone. This event is, as you know, live streamed and recorded, and we will be posting the recording on the social media platforms of the Program for Law and Society, Musawa, and the co-sponsors. So before I introduce our distinguished speakers, some logistical points first. We'll start by a discussion with the panel, where I'll be asking them some questions for 45 minutes, and then the remainder of the time, it will be open for all of you to discuss and pose questions and comments, and to keep it interactive and dynamic. We are excited to welcome with us today 3 special Muslim women's rights advocates who have worked relentlessly, really, to defend the rights of women in their own contexts and globally. With us today is, to my right, Zaina Anwar, leading Malaysian feminist and women's rights activist. She co-founded 2 groundbreaking women's groups that engage with Islam from a rights perspective to promote equality and justice for women living in Muslim contexts. The first one is the very famous Sisters in Islam, Malaysian organization, and the second one is the global Musawa movement for equality and justice in the Muslim world. Zaina has received many international awards in recognition of her brave and important work worldwide. Also with us today is Hishama Hameen, the campaign manager for the Global Campaign for Equality in Family Law at Equality Now, where she works globally to advocate for family law reform. She also co-founded the Muslim Personal Law Reform Action Group in her home country, Sri Lanka, to advocate for reform of the discriminatory Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act and family court system. Last but not least, some of you might already know Fargana Ansari, a Pakistani lawyer working in the field of international human rights law, gender equality, and Muslim family law reform. She completed her LLM right here in HLS, and she completed it in January 2022 on a Fulbright scholarship. She now works as an international advocacy program officer at Musawa. A warm welcome to you all, and we are honored to have you here with us today in Cambridge. Before I start posing my first question to the panel, I want to acknowledge the struggles of our sisters and brothers in Iran today and express our full solidarity as they struggle to reclaim their human rights, dignity, and basic freedoms. There's no better time than now to have the discussion we're having here today. It's about our collective efforts to end all forms of state violence, repression, and gender discrimination in both East and West, North and South. In tandem with what's happening in Iran today, this panel showcases our various attempts to democratize the discourse on Muslim women and contexts, showing how this work is developed and led by Muslim women for their Muslim communities. We were mindful to engage with local activists for our discussion today, as they are the best people to talk about their context and work. We want to move away from white saviorism and Western-centric frameworks towards a framework that is premised on the genuine equality of all. A framework where we can creatively weave different discourses together, such as Islam and human rights, maybe, to better reflect the richness of our shared and common humanity. So let us start with Zaina. Zaina, you are a globally well-known Muslim feminist human rights activist and a renowned Malaysian journalist. Your work on gender equality and justice in Muslim contexts has really been groundbreaking, conducted as it is in very challenging circumstances on really difficult issues. What brought you here to this point? Why did you start doing this kind of work, Zaina?
I guess the obvious answer for me is rage. It's outrage at the injustice done, and foremost at the injustice done in the name of God, in the name of Islam. Because I grew up with religion, I grew up with faith. I grew up with an utter belief that God is just, that Islam is a just religion, and to be confronted with discrimination as an adult. I'm much older than all of you. The Iranian women demonstrating today grew up with that unjust, Islam, but not my period. My period, no identity politics, no political Islam. So I grew up with this utter faith in a just God and a just Islam. And to be confronted as an adult with so much, the patriarchy, the discriminatory laws, when we really demanded for change and everything was justified, but this is God's law, is divine law that cannot be questioned, that cannot be challenged. And I just couldn't accept that. And of course, I could have turned my back on Islam, like many feminists do, because, of the belief, and many others, not just Muslim feminists, other feminists, like the belief that religion is inherently unjust and patriarchal. But I couldn't do that because I grew up with religion and because of an utter belief that God is just. And so I decided then to open up the Quran and to understand the religion again, from a different perspective, to really find out, does the religion say what these men in authority are saying? That women are inferior to men, that a man has a right to beat his wife, a man has a right to 4 wives, a man can divorce his wife at will, all these things that were pummeling us. The reality of our lived Islam, was in conflict to a faith that says something else, So it was then that my friends and we decided to open up the Quran, to read the Quran for ourselves, once again, with all these feminist questions, to search for answers, to search for solutions to the contemporary problems that we face. And it was there, that we realized that there are other understandings of Islam. There are messages in the Quran that talk about justice, about equality, about compassion, about men and women being each other's friend, each other's protector, each other's garment. How come these messages that exist in the Quran did not inform the laws that govern us in our daily lives? Who decided, who has the authority to decide that this interpretation that is discriminatory will be the source of law, will be the source of public practice? And that was really when we decided that this is not about Islam. This is not about God. This is about power, about authority, about privilege, and men in authority wanting to use the God and their understanding of God to justify patriarchy and their continued domination over women in their private lives and in public life as well. So that was really when, it is that knowledge, that faith, in the possibility of change, the possibility of reform, that gave us the courage in the end to go public. So this work, Sisters in Islam, the first group that I co-founded, it's probably a pioneering group in the Muslim context because we were probably the first women's group to decide to engage with religion from a rights perspective, because our laws, our public policy, and our daily lives were affected by a discriminatory understanding of Islam. So we decided we can't avoid but engage with Islam and bring this new knowledge and this alternative discourse of rights, of justice, of possibility of equality in Islam to the public space, because we can't bring change hiding behind 4 walls and whispering to the right people in authority. We needed to mobilize support, and we needed to change that public discourse, for the change that we want to bring to be sustainable and effective. So really, that's how we began. More than 30 years ago, before you were all born, and before Islam became fashionable. Nobody was interested in Islam at that time. But because we were affected by the rise of political Islam in our country, that was when we decided we have to do something. We have to break the hegemony that patriarchs and religious authorities have over matters of religion in a country where religion is used as a source of law and public policy.
So really, you started with the very simple yet revolutionary act of reading the Quran again.
The
Iqra.
first word revealed to the
Iqra.
prophet.
Exactly, the first word in the Quran. Thank you, Zaina, for this. Hishama, you come from a very different context. It's a Muslim minority context. You're also from a different generation from Zaina's. In your country, Sri Lanka, there's been a lot of upheaval going on. In what ways do you think it is better or worse for your generation and context today?
Firstly, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak here. It's, I mean, what an amazing campus. Of course, yes, a generation later, I guess, but in my teens and 20s, as with many young people today, religious identity was something that we grapple with growing up, right? But as a minority from Sri Lanka, but also having moved to another minority context, Nepal, and having grown up there, in a world where Islam was being defined by powerful people, in the confines of binaries and the confines of dogma, if you're not with us, you are with them type language was being used when they talked about Muslims. You know what I'm talking about. I don't need to say this explicitly, but Muslim women were being portrayed as victims of a villainous faith by the Western media, but also victims of villainous men. So the Western lens really had a very different take on how Muslim women were. And cis and musawa did not exist online for teens at the time, right? Not in the capacity that they are now. And and there was absolutely no feminist language to approaching Islam. It was very male-led, it was very male-dominated. And while in the current context, we still find very patriarchal, interpretations of religion, and the mainstream is, of course, the patriarchal narrative of Islam. It's a vastly different context today because the nature of the discourse has changed. There's a lot more nuance to it. There's a lot more options in terms of searching for an answer to something if you Google something online, right? So I think that context, particularly provided to us by the World Wide Web, thank you, is a vastly different one to grow up with today. And Muslim women have been connecting and sharing this knowledge across borders and in terms of activism. And the feminist space outside of the Muslim world have also provided opportunities for Muslim women to connect and to share this information, that it's almost got spread and democratized across borders. And I think what's really important is that this generation, particularly younger to me, has now got the ability, along with social media, to use this knowledge and this activism, from the generations before us, to really step up and be courageous in terms of questioning, imams online, in terms of engaging, with trolls, right? In terms of even having conversations on our streets and within our families, because we have this diversity of resources in our capacity. Of course, there are challenges. And I want to put it very succinctly in the words of a leading human rights activist, Dia Khan, in describing this. She said, women, whenever we're defining ourselves, or, whenever we're coming forward as ourselves and writing our own stories, we have religious leaders, self-appointed community leaders who condemn us and who define us and want to contain us, into whatever fits them, on one hand. On the other hand, we have racists and Islamophobes who want us, Muslim women, to remain in the posture of victims. But as you can see, Muslim women are here. They have been speaking out for decades, and they continue to be speaking out within their own communities, finding answers and solutions from within their faith, demanding change, as you hear in the questions going forward, and saying that human rights does not stop at the door, at the front door, just because we are a Muslim household. It will enter the door, we will embody it, and we will live it as part of our faith. And I think that's what's so beautiful about this shifting generational discourse.
So you really don't need to choose, like generations before, between having a faith and being treated as an equal citizen, really. Thank you, Hishama. For Ghana, now turning to you, as an HLS graduate here, what caused you to start engaging with these issues when you were here in Harvard? And really afterwards, how did your training in Harvard Law School help you carry this forward in your professional life?
Thank you so much. First of all, really, really happy to be here. I agree, Hish, it's a wonderful campus. I love it. But yeah, so about engaging with these issues, I think it started way before HLS. HLS did do a lot of things, did contribute to a lot of things, but it started when I was very young. As you've already talked about, both of you, we live these realities in our homes, in our countries. I am from Pakistan. I've grown up there. When I was barely maybe 12 or 13, I started seeing these gender roles that I was slowly being pushed into. And I did not want to be pushed into those roles. And that's when I started realizing that this is wrong. But my reactions to those with time were also very different. So when I was really young, I used to say I hate being a girl. And then grew up a little, understood a little bit about the patriarchy. And that's when I understood it's the patriarchy that I dislike. It's not being a girl that I hate. And then, you know, slowly I start going to law school. And that's where I was introduced to, in Pakistan, I was introduced to the legal side of things, the legal side of Muslim family law specifically, and how that impacts a lot of women in Pakistan, a majority of women in Pakistan, because a lot of them haven't even joined the workforce. So discrimination at the workplace or in the economy, that's not what matters to them as much as Muslim family law matters to them, to every home, to every household, and the inequalities in that. So I started witnessing that. And then that's where I started realizing that there is a problem in the law, there's a problem in society, and how we use religion to justify all of these inequalities in divorce provisions, in marriage provisions, in guardian requirements, all of that. And then, you know, when I joined HLS, I was fairly sort of sure that I wanted to work somewhere within the gender area, but this specifically being introduced to Muslim family law in an organization like Musawa was through Harvard, because there was an event when I was doing my virtual semester back from Pakistan. There was an event that Musawa did back in 2020. You were speaking there. I think you were there as well. And then I attended that, and that's where I got introduced to this entire concept and the idea of reforming from within Islam. And I really, really liked it. But even outside of that, I got involved with the Harvard Advocates for Human Rights, the clinic. I didn't really get involved in, but it's also a great opportunity to sort of involve yourself in Musawa's work, because they've done collaborations with Musawa as well. So these opportunities like these at Harvard were really something that I valued. My work at Harvard Advocates was something that really helped with me understanding the treaty body mechanisms. And now the work that I do with Musawa as an international advocacy officer is very similar. So engaging with the CEDAW committee, getting favorable concluding observations out of them, all of that sort of work I really understood through my work here. And then my courses, of course, you know, comparative constitutional law really, you know, lets you understand how affirmative action, for instance, works in different countries and all of that. So, you know, it's been a journey, but Harvard really, really, really pushed me into the right direction in where I wanted to work, because it's not something that just, you know, you want to work for out of public interest generally, but something that impacts you on a daily basis. I'm back to Pakistan. I'm living my reality there. So as I'm working and submitting thematic reports for different countries, I'm also living that same reality in my home or, you know, outside in society. So that is something that I continue to work for, and I will want to work for, and just really, really happy to be here as well, to be doing that.
So actually your time in Harvard was good to nurture the interests that were already there for you. Okay, so you guys seem to be in the right place then. Okay, so in many Muslim contexts, and Zaina has already spoken a bit about that, religion is still a very important force. It's not just in our constitutions informing our laws, you know, it's also in society. People still find religion an important source of nurturance, yeah, spiritual nurturance, strength, communal gathering. So it's still very important. And we can't just throw it out of the window and say, no, it's patriarchal, we can't deal with it. No, we have to. But in the process of engaging with religion, we discovered, we already knew that it's a very dangerous business, actually. And why is that? Because it usually involves the disruption of dominant power structure. Religion is a very, very powerful weapon in most of our contexts. And it deals with power, the power of men over women, the power of the state and its religious authorities over citizens, but also the power over the division of wealth and goods. And so in this very contentious context, contentious context, pushing for a religious discourse that is egalitarian, that is respectful of human rights, can actually get you a bit in trouble. And trying to forge that discourse from within isn't easy business. And so I want to ask you, Zaina, can you tell us how you found that Islamic law holds within it the possibilities of gender equality and justice in such a difficult context?
Well, it's really been a long journey. And really, you cannot do this work without knowledge. Knowledge is so important. Scholarship is so important. Getting the support of Salma and her team at the the International Human Rights Clinic. You know, we've been so lucky. I've been so lucky. You know, when we started this work in the late 80s, there was like really not much scholarship on the issue of Islam and women's rights, Islam and human rights. You know, there was like maybe 1 or 2 books and that's it. And that was not good enough for us. But we were so lucky that, you know, it was post-Iranian revolution, the world was changing. So there were scholars, a few scholars who already had begun to engage. And so because they heard about Sisters in Islam, because you know we were in the public sphere writing letters to the editor, making statements. So they actually got in touch with us and we started working with them. And that knowledge of the possibility of equality, of justice, of reform is so critical. I don't know whether Harvard Law School teaches Islamic law or Islamic legal theory now, you know, because I mean, for me too, it was a discovery. The sophistication of Islamic legal theory that developed in the 12th, 13th century, the sophistication of legal concepts like maslaha, public interest in the 12th century, what public, but it existed in the legal tradition. Ikhtilaf, differences of opinion, choosing the best opinion among a variety of opinions. These were revolutionary. And for me as a Muslim, I'm very proud of that legal tradition, to know that these legal concepts and tools that allow for reform to take place in changing times and circumstances, it exists in our tradition, but they got shunted aside. You know, those in religious authority did not popularize this concept to justify why reform can take place. In fact, instead, they use, you know, in their interpatriarchal interpretations to justify why reform cannot take place. So learning about these concepts from scholars like Ziba Mir Hosseini, like Amina Wadud, like Khalid Masood from Pakistan, Fatih Osman from Egypt, amazing men that many people didn't know about, and amazing women, of course, you know, who were their groundbreaking work was so instrumental in enabling us and giving us the courage. You know, really, it's knowledge that gives you power, that gives you knowledge, that gives you courage, to stand up and speak out for the possibility of reform. So we really developed, you know, in Musawa. So from Sisters in Islam, when we had little 8-page question and answer booklets, are men and women equal in Islam? Does Islam allow a man to beat his wife? Is polygamy a right in Islam? From those beginning Q&A booklets to offer an alternative discourse in the public space, we developed into Musawa, we launched Musawa, where we really engage with the scholarship and to really popularize these legal tools and concepts, you know, to highlight how you can use them to push for reform. And it's not just the legal tools and concepts in the Islamic legal tradition. In the fact that this is, you know, our states are modern nation states that exist within the international system. You signed the CEDAW Convention, you signed various UN conventions. How do you reconcile the call for equality, for justice, for human rights with your understanding of Islam? So with Musawa, we developed the framework for action, where our call for reform is not just located within Islamic legal tradition, within Islamic principles, but grounded holistically with Islamic principles, human rights principles, constitutional guarantees of equality and non-discrimination that most of our Muslim countries have, and the lived realities of men and women today, contemporary times, contemporary contexts, contemporary values. So that Musawa framework, you know, is just so important for us to push for reform, you know, and the legal tools and the concepts. And this is what we're trying to do now, to popularize this, because, you know, in Geneva, when we go to the CEDAW committee in the early years, like the CEDAW committee themselves were frustrated with Muslim governments. When governments fly the flag of Islam, everybody goes catatonic. They don't know what to do. Okay, that's your religion, go change your religion, or rather no, go change your laws to comply with your CEDAW obligations. But governments, they don't have the political will, and they don't even know of the alternatives that exist. So what we have been able to do in Geneva is to provide arguments, concepts, tools of how change towards equality and justice is possible to enable Muslim governments to comply with their treaty obligations. And the work that we've done, the family law tables we have developed, the examples to show the diversity. What divine law are you talking about? When there's diversity of laws in all these Muslim countries on polygamy, on right to divorce, on equal age of marriage, there are differences. So it's not divine law. These are man-made laws. The source may be divine revelation, but how that source is understood and interpreted and used as and codified into law, that's men. It's men who sit in parliament to make these laws. It is not God. So just making that difference to break the fear that so many Muslims have in engaging with Islam and engaging with Islamic law. This is not about Islam. This is about law, politics, power, authority. So that it is that knowledge that is so critical to enable us to push for reform.
Thank you. Exactly. Knowledge. Knowledge is a construction by humans, for humans. And I don't know if you know Sheikh Muhammad Abdo, he was the Grand Mufti of Egypt more than 100 years ago, very progressive man. And he used to always say that Islamic law was created by men. And he would always say, they were men and we are also men creating this knowledge. So today, fast forward 2022, we say they are men and we are women and men creating this knowledge. So thank you for bringing that to the fore. Hishama, can you give us an example or several examples, in fact, how this kind of knowledge is now being taken up on the ground by Muslim women in their activism to make changes in the ground?
Sure. So we've been hearing stories about how Muslim women came into this activism through active inquiry on why the discrimination. And I think it's the evolution of finding the why that also led to the how. So I'm going to speak a little bit about what's happening and what we're observing happen at the region, at the national, regional, and global level, because it's happening across the world at multiple in multiple spaces. So some examples about this. We see that there's this development of the scholarship that Zaina was talking about to show the diversity of Islamic law, where different schools of thought are based on human interpretation, and that's fallible, that's changeable, etc. And we have countries like Indonesia, like Malaysia, Sisters in Islam, use this work to really do, to put their communities and their countries through a thought process of reforming their laws based on Islamic legal tradition and the various tools that are available within the Islamic jurisprudence. We're seeing it in countries like Morocco and Tunisia, for example, in Turkey, where the Quranic text was used. The very text was used to address the issue of polygamy, for example. Marwa might be able to speak a little bit more about that. And then we see countries in South Asia, like the Bharatiya Muslim Mahila Andolan or the Indian Muslim Women's Movement, who are then taking this knowledge and then also applying constitutional guarantees of equality and using strategic litigation to push for rights, Muslim women's rights, and an end to discriminatory practices like the triple divorce. I don't know if you've heard about the practice of triple divorce in India, where a Muslim man can divorce the wife by saying talak, talak, talak 3 times, also known as a 3-second divorce. So they've taken this issue, they've mobilized on the ground, they've utilized strategic litigation, they've utilized constitutional guarantees of equality to push this issue and get an act that abolished this practice. And then contexts like Sri Lanka. Very interesting context where in my own country, there is no constitutional guarantees, full constitutional guarantees of equality for laws that existed prior to the constitution, including the Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act. The Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act can have and has multiple discriminatory provisions, but does not have to abide by the constitutional guarantees of equality. So what do Muslim women do in this context? We can see that Muslim women's movements have been mobilizing from within faith groups. So working with scholars, working with, with sort of government committees, trying to bring this issue to the table. We see younger groups doing digital activism around this issue. There's a lot of content. If you Google Muslim women's rights in Sri Lanka, a lot of it will come up in terms of digital advocacy campaigns that Muslim women have been engaging with. And we're seeing, so that's at the kind of, bringing this issue up as a citizenship right, as a right to, as a human right, that the religion cannot stop at the front door of our homes, right? Just because we're Muslim. But also we're seeing that groups engage with the CEDAW committee, like Zaina mentioned. They're taking this issue one step further and reporting, in international human rights frameworks. So literally no stone unturned. They're having conversations from within their families all the way up to the global level. Regionally, very interesting things happening. We're seeing mobilizing that have been happening over time through Musawa movements and other organizations that are mobilizing in the MENA region. So Equality Now and Musawa is in partnership, doing work in the regional, in the MENA region and the African region. Just recently, last week, Musawa, Equality Now, Femnet and Siha Network launched the Africa Regional Network on Family Laws, looking at civil, customary, and Muslim laws, and really engaging with regional frameworks like Maputo Protocol to push for rights of women, in family law. And globally, another interesting level where things are moving. Musawa has a campaign for justice in Muslim family laws specifically, and there's also the campaign that I'm a part of, which is the Global Campaign for Equality in Family Law. It's an 8 coalition-led campaign of women's rights organizations that are saying, hey, we want to make this issue as big as the GBV issue. We wanted to make it as big as the FGM movement. This is an issue that has been ignored for far too long. It's affecting our lives at home, women's rights groups, everything from women's rights groups to the international spaces need to engage with family law. We really need an inquiry. We need to make this a priority global issue. And hence, this conversation is also going to start, has been, and also will be further taking place at that level as well. So I think some very exciting work coming up.
Thank you, Hishama. It's very important to see clearly the relationship between Muslim family law and any other kind of law in a woman's life in Muslim context. You can have the right to be a candidate for president, but you might not be able to access it because you have to obey your husband by law. Yeah, you might be able to work, as a CEO of a big company, and you go to a conference outside your country. You get stopped in the airport because you don't have the permission to travel from your male guardian. So you can have all these wonderful rights constitutionally, but then if the family law itself is so regressive, it cancels all this. That's why economics, countries are unable to tap onto the economic power of women because of the family law. And that's why, and what we're saying is that it doesn't have to be like that. In fact, you can use Islam still as the basis of the family law if you want, as a country, but it does not have to discriminate against women in that way. In fact, there is an Islamic discourse that very much treats women just as equal as men. So thank you for that. Now I turn to Fergana, because we want to talk more about human rights. So in your work, and also as an HLS graduate, can you please let us know a bit about, how are Muslim women's voices interacting with international human rights advocacy?
Thank you for that. Even at HLS, when I was engaging with the Harvard Advocates for Human Rights and the work that they were doing, and then after joining Musawa as the International Advocacy Officer, I got to understand how, treaty body mechanisms generally work. But then I really understood the kind of impact that we can have through them when I joined Musawa. And that was, for instance, the CEDAW committee, the Committee for the Engagement of Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. So when we go there, we engage with them. We try to get this national advocacy groups to speak and say out what their issues are, and we try to support them in them raising the issues of concern that they want to. So for instance, if it's if it's Pakistan, if it's something relating to child marriage, and child marriage is something that is a big issue in the country, then it is going to be something that we raise. And the way that we work is we try to support those national advocacy groups rather than speaking for them. So we're collaborating with them constantly, and then trying to get them to submit these thematic reports, shadow reports, to those treaty body mechanisms like CEDAW, so that those local activists who otherwise wouldn't have that kind of an access to government representatives, to officials, to ask them these questions and ask for reform, they can do that through that international advocacy path. So the way that we do it is when we are going to Geneva, we're giving out public statements either on behalf of the local advocates. If there is a security concern there, then we tend to do that as well. Otherwise, we get them to speak if they're able to and if they want to. And then what's really heartening to see is the CEDAW committee often raises the exact same questions that these local activists want to ask from those government representatives, and they ask those questions word to word to those representatives, instead of those local activists just not having that kind of access ever. So that is something that is really powerful in trying to engage internationally. And the way that we do that, especially like she's already mentioned, we don't want government representatives to ever say, oh, this is Sharia law, this is where we stop, we can't do any reform beyond that. The way that we build that argument is, here's 3 more countries, which are Muslim countries. They have already done this. They've already enacted this law. They've used these kinds of arguments, for instance, to enact these laws. You can do the same. Why not? So that is, we don't want the CEDAW committee to just, be like, oh, we can't engage further because this is a religious matter. We don't want them to stop there. So that is the kind of work that we're doing. And it's almost, it's honestly really, really good and nice to see. For instance, for the UAE in the previous session, when we gave out statements, there was not even a single local activist present there. And we were able to give out statements, for the UAE to raise these issues. And that is something that I found was really powerful as well. So, submitting these reports, public statements, private meetings, all of those we do. And then other than that, with the International Human Rights Clinic that I was talking about, we've done a collaboration on Muslim family law tables. So for each country that is a Muslim country or has Muslim family laws in minority context, we've done Muslim family law tables in which we see what the current state of the law is and what's missing and what's not. So that is something that is also the knowledge that we use to bring to treaty body mechanisms like that. We're also engaging with UN special rapporteurs and special procedures mandates. And, whenever they have country visits or they're publishing their thematic reports and they're in conversation with government representatives, they also do calls for inputs. And that's when we also provide them the kind of information that they need on the state of that country and the family laws there. So this is the sort of work that we're doing, and we're sort of trying to use the international human rights framework to try to bring that change. I think it's going really well. We're also trying to expand on that work, trying to include SDGs into our, treaty body reporting. So let's see where that goes. But overall, I think it's generally really powerful that you're able to empower those local advocates to be able to speak before the CEDAW committee and then before the government representatives generally.
Thank you, Fergana. So these are going to be my last 2 questions, and then we'll open it up. And since we're focusing also on human rights, whenever Islamic law and human rights come into one sentence, we know where that conversation is usually headed. Yeah, it's not usually a constructive conversation for some reason. And that's mainly because a lot of people seem to think with binaries. So it's either that human rights, secularism, respect of humanity, one side, Islamic law, regression, gender discrimination on another. And it depends if you're on the other side, it becomes human rights, Western imperialism, loose morals on one side, and on the other, it's Islamic law, high ethical moral standards, and being a patriot, basically, and loyal to your culture. So these binaries make it very, very difficult to have a constructive conversation between Islam and human rights sometimes. Now, Zaina, how have you navigated these binaries in your work on women's rights and family law reforms in Muslim contexts?
Well, it's really interesting how things have changed. When I began in the 1980s and early 1990s to talk about the importance, the critical importance of engaging with religion and challenging religious authorities and challenging governments that use religion to justify discrimination, I face opposition both from the Islamists and the patriarchs and the conservatives and the feminists, Muslim feminists, the grand dames of the feminist movement in the Muslim world, who really felt that, Islam has no role to play in public life. But I said, but your laws are based on Islam. How can you say Islam has no role to play in public life when you're governed by Islamic law and Islamic practices and Islamic policy? And that, Islam is inherently, well, not just Islam, all religions inherently unjust and patriarchal. Forget about religion. Let's just focus on human rights principles. But for us, certainly in Malaysia, in the Southeast Asian region, we had the space to engage with religion. And we recognized very early on, the critical importance of engaging with religion and really breaking the hegemony of, what patriarchs have over religion. And so, and we really felt that, in a country where religion is used as a source of law and public policy, I don't see how you can just ignore religion, because ignoring religion means giving them, the patriarchs, the conservatives, the hegemony over our lives. And so that was why we felt it was so important to reconcile religion and human rights, to find ways to do it. And I had shared with you that. And really, if the women's movement had started this in the 1990s, maybe things might turn out differently. But when I presented this at the regional level to do it, oh, forget it. I was a young person. Those were grand dames. I couldn't, I didn't have the power to, change their minds. But really now, today is very different. So for me, one of the most, innovating comment to have is from young people, especially young Muslims based in the US, in the West, who said, thank God for sisters in Islam. Thank God for Musawa. Now I don't have to choose being a feminist and a Muslim. I can remain a Muslim and be a feminist. So for me, that is so critical. So the work and the scholarship has evolved so much, and the context too, because religion has not gone away. It's still, it's very much there, not just in the Muslim world, in the US as well, So we need to engage. We need to create our own authority, our own voice, and claim responsibility about how it is used, as a source of law and public policy. So, the twain can meet, and really the battleground is not Islamic feminism versus secular feminism, Islam versus human rights. Really, the battleground is between, despotism, authoritarianism, patriarchy on the one hand, and justice, equality, democracy on the other. Wherever the source is, that is the battle that we need to fight, So, and I feel like in Muslim context, we really have no choice. We have to reconcile that, because religion is not going away. From the 1950s development theory that as a country develops, religion will become irrelevant. Look at where we are. So let's just be real and engage with it in constructive ways in which, we can engage to, build, push for the justice that we want, the equality that we want, the democracy that we want.
Thank you. Thank you, Zaina. I'm not going to ask Hishama my final question about equality. Oh, can we? Oh, great. Okay. Because then from what you say and from what we know as well, why does the conversation usually turn sour between Islamic law and human rights? Usually it has something to do with the notion of equality. Equality, substantive, formal, transformative equality is a problem for some people who believe that women and men cannot be equal under Islam. And let's face it, Islamic law does give women some very good privileges unequal to men. So a Muslim woman does not have to spend one dime on herself, on her family, even if she is richer than the husband by law. And if he doesn't spend on her, she can put him in prison. Yeah, this is one thing. So even breastfeeding, if she does the breastfeeding, the husband is obliged to pay her. You know, it's not part of her responsibility according to classical. See, yeah, some people are nodding their heads. Not bad, huh? So if you have equality here, women are going to lose. And that's what we keep hearing from all these Muslim governments and international human rights forums. Yeah, they tell us, okay, you want equality? Women are going to lose all these privileges. So, Hishama, how do you deal with that?
Wow. Okay. First and foremost, data. Lived realities and evidence building is crucial to, fundamental to any type of engagement, at any level when it comes to religious discourse, human rights, bringing issues, and various forums, etc. We see what you described play out very well at the CEDAW committee level, particularly when there's constructive dialogues happening between state parties and the CEDAW committee. And I think one of the really great things that Salma's clinic, based here at Harvard Law School, has been able to do is help organizations like Musawa and I think many other organizations gather that information. How are the laws discriminating against women and girls? What is happening when it comes to entering into marriage during the time of divorce, during the time of, at the time of polygamy, in terms of access to justice? Using that data, then Muslim women's groups who have also collected their own lived realities and cases can supplement this information and really make a push for change, for reform of laws, right? So I think it's really crucial at any level, in any level of opposition, to bring the argument to the table with data and evidence building. So thank you so much for the database that you helped Musawa develop, because I think when it comes to the Muslim world, it's really critical information. And I urge you to take a look at that, because what we're also then now trying to see is how then have customary and civil laws, how are they discriminating against women and girls? So I think that scholarship is developing, as we speak. And what's really interesting also is when states say this, Muslim women are now ready with arguments. We can see evidence, feminist scholarship that has developed to show alternate ways. Like Fargana said, we can give examples of other countries that have reformed family laws, and hence why not you? Because your context is similar, the source of your laws is similar, right? So there is arguments that Muslim women are bringing to the table when it comes to Muslim majority context. Muslim minority context is a slightly different ballgame, because you have state parties that argue to say, no, too politically sensitive, cannot deal with Muslim minority issues right now, will come off as Islamophobes. No, it's your faith, it's a minority right, we can't touch this law. Or it's, we're going into community, definitely the fact that community is not ready. The Muslim community is not ready for change. There is no consensus for reform within the Muslim community. The number of times we've heard that, we'd be very rich if we got a dime each time. And so for those arguments, particularly from Muslim minority context, we Muslim women are coming up with the pushbacks to say, we are the community. What are you talking about? We're 50% of the community. Here's the evidence for how the laws discriminate against us. Here's the evidence for Muslim contexts that have reformed the laws, right? So there's a lot of evidence building that women's movements are engaging with. And I think in your discourse and in your capacity, one of the biggest allyship that you could provide for Muslim women's groups, particularly from the global South, is one, you have to seek out activists who are working in their local context. I think we still live in the world where when you say Muslim women, you're hearing a lot of Western, voices. And I think there's the majority of the Muslims live in the global South. You have to seek out their stories and find out the activism, the type of energy that they're bringing to their own community work. And I want to say, and one last thing, which is that Muslim women are organizing globally. We may not hear their stories because of language barriers, but there's some really exciting work coming out from Indonesia, largest Muslim majority context, of Muslim ulemas, Muslim scholars redefining, women ulemas, redefining their Islamic family laws through using the exact same tools that men supposedly use, and engaging in multiple other ways, plus organizing happening at multiple levels. So urge you in your platforms, in your work, seek out those stories, connect with those movements, and bolster and amplify them in whatever way you can. So those would actually be my closing words.
Thank you, Hishama. So Kelly has kindly agreed to help us. So let's open it up for discussion. And if you have any questions, comments, yes, please, to the lady in the, maybe for the live, yeah, thank you.
Hi, my name is Arushi and I'm an LLM student over here and I'm from India. My question is specifically to Hashama, who just mentioned about becoming allies specifically for Muslim women in a minority context. And this is something that I'm grappling with to just understand and to have a viewpoint. I don't know if anybody has been following, but recently in India, the right to wear a hijab has become very contested. Because there's a state of Karnataka in the south that imposed a seemingly secular order that women in educational institutions cannot wear hijab or any other religious coverings. Actually, I don't even think it said women in educational institutions, it just banned religious coverings. But the disproportionate effect of that is on women. And primarily the opposition to that has been from Muslim women, and you would think liberal Muslim lawyers. Now, as a law clerk who at the time was working at the Supreme Court and was sort of potentially figuring out how to think of this issue, I would say that my opinion is slightly colored because of the government that passed the law, which is a right-wing government and a Hindu government or a Hindutva government. So I'm just trying to grapple with how do you ally with these women? One side of me tries to think that the movement, the change has to come from within the community. And so if they're not ready for it, you can't possibly impose this on them. And it's a right to freedom of expression and choice, et cetera, et cetera. The other side is that if it was a facially secular government doing this, I would be pro it. So I'm just trying to see, like, how do you feel that women or persons who are not from the religion as you are, how can they be better allies to you in this?
Thank you. And yeah, let's try and keep them short. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes, please, Abadir.
Thank you. First, let me say that as a man, I stand in solidarity with you and what you do. My question is, how successful have you been, or how much progress do you think there needs to be done in terms of putting what you're saying, this progressive interpretation, into knowledge structures of Islam? You know, you've talked about the CEDAW committee, you've talked about Geneva, you've talked about universities, and Islamic knowledge is, in my estimation, Islamic knowledge development takes place in schools that teach imams, schools that teach qadis, and I wonder how much of this progressive work is infiltrating into these institutions. Maybe to put it in other words, you know, when you do a CEDAW report in Geneva, have you ever wondered if you went to the mosque in Geneva, whether you'd even be allowed to go in based on who the imam is? And that's the knowledge type I'm talking about.
Thank you, Abadir. Yes, very important. Anyone else? Hava, please. And then we go to the panel. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Just to follow up on Abadir's question, have in any of the contexts in any Muslim countries you've been working, have there ever been any traditional or traditional leaning scholar, men and women, who would come as close as, you know, we are hoping to this reformist interpretation or not? And also from the feminist secular organizations. So after they've seen how much you grow and how much arguments and new ideas you have there been any also closeness or bridging effort from them? So and how much, when you compare these two seemingly at the beginning, they were very far away from you. So do you see which one got closer to you and more sympathetic in your work? Thank you.
Thank you. So who would like to go first? Zaina? Yeah, Zaina?
Okay. Maybe I'll answer, some aspects of the two questions here, and the others to please add. Yeah, I mean, breaking that monopoly within traditional institution is like really a huge challenge. And for Musawa over the next 5 years, it's really about multiplying our voice, amplifying our work, accelerating the impact on the ground. So we don't work at national levels. We work with advocates, national level advocates, empower them, give them the training with the knowledge that we have, to build that capacity to influence national level change, national level work. And certainly, like Hishama mentioned, Indonesia is just amazing what's happening over there. The Women Ulama conference that happened this year is coming on. If any of you are interested to see grassroots women ulama, it's just amazing what, they come out with fatwas to, on domestic violence, on child marriage, and using the Musawa framework, arguing. It was so amazing to see them on stage, the Quran, someone holding the Quran, Sido, like Sido on stage by these 500 women ulama, the national constitution, and the lived realities of women. It is amazing. But that is really dependent on the work of the national level advocates. And in Indonesia, what is very interesting as well is that, many of the feminists working on women's rights come from religious background. So come from the pesantren, the madrasas in Indonesia. So it was easier for them to penetrate that system and have the connections, to engage with the women leaders of these madrasas and to really move it forward. And we do have one of the scholars I mentioned, Professor Khalid Masood, both a traditional Sharia scholar and a civil law, legal scholar who is a judge in the Supreme Court of Pakistan, who was the head of the Islamic Ideology Council of Pakistan, really engaging with us very closely, and learning the lived realities from us. We ask, he's always the only man in our meetings, and we say, like, Professor Khalid, like, you're okay with this? Yeah, because it's an exchange of knowledge. He learns the lived realities of women, and that shapes his evolving scholarship and understanding of fiqh. Yeah, and bringing it that back to the Ideology Council in terms of law reform and all that. So it's really up to national level advocates, and what Musawa does as a global organization is to provide support to them, to enable them, to use the knowledge, the feminist rights-based knowledge of Islam that we are building, to push at the national level. In terms of, like which ally, I think, I can't speak globally, but certainly in the Malaysian context from both sides, actually. And globally, maybe I can talk more about the secular feminists who've come much closer to our work, because of the realities on the ground. In the early days, there was just so much opposition, but now, especially from young women. And the training that Musawa does, the Islam, and I engage Islam and gender equality and justice that we do for women's rights and human rights activists, is really a personally transformative moment for these Muslim activists, because many of them have left, like, forget about Islam, don't touch the Quran. They've not opened the Quran or even touched the Quran in 13 years, in 15 years. And it's our training, they have to open up the Quran. And so for them, it's even though you think religion is irrelevant, it's unimportant, but you're born into it's inherently inside you, but you've chosen not to grapple with all these contradictions you're facing. So attending our training is, sometimes they bawl their heads off at the end of the training to really, they've actually, some of them have said, one of them is actually now a very public national figure, I won't name names, is that, I have been cheated of a relationship with my God because I grew up with this unjust understanding of Islam, and on that basis, I rejected Islam. But now, I find the possibility of finding justice, compassion, equality in Islam. And so, yeah, so it's very liberating and transformative for them. So I find that more at the global level. Yeah. So I mean, the work is really exciting work for us, because it's really relatively new work, and just to see the impact of the work, and especially on young people. For me, when I give talks, especially on college campuses, to have Muslim students come up to me and to say how important this is for them, especially Muslims living in the Western context, is really very, very satisfying to see that impact on the ground.
Thank you, Zaina. Hishama?
Just to add to what Zaina said, I think I'm going to take off my global campaign manager hat and put on my activist hat for these three questions, which is that, yes, we are absolutely seeing change on the ground. I mean, CEDAW, for example, is just one mechanism that women's rights groups on the ground are using to get political will, to move on political will, right? And in either an incentive or, the carrot and the stick approach in that sense, to bring in even naming and shaming, to say our governments are not doing what they said they would do. So CEDAW is just one small mechanism that women's rights groups use. There's a large array of things that they use to engage with religious scholars. We're having conversation with scholars all the time. I'll give you an example of Sri Lanka. When MPL-RAG, Muslim Personal Law Reform Action Group, started off this work in 2016 to push for reform, comprehensive reform, 14 plus issues, of problems within the Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act, we had a lot of pushback from the Jamiatul Ulema and from religious scholars. They did not want to move on issues, even, saying that marriage age can be raised slightly, but not too slightly. But now we're at the stage where there's almost a bill in Parliament with them having agreed to 18 without exception. How did that happen in the span of 6 years? Because of public discourse, because women's groups created public pressure and made it a national issue. But also what's really interesting is as a result of the societal dialogue that's happening, you have registrars. I mean, my sister got married last year. The registrar basically said, this MMDA, this Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act chatter is going on, and all these couples want to now sign their marriage certificates and all the women want to sign. So this societal chatter is also creating conversations among the religious institutions and registrars and qadis and so on. So that's a really interesting shift that's happening, where the reform might be delayed, but the societal shift is happening towards that. And that's something that we're seeing. And I want to respond to your question. I think when there's an issue of binaries, such as the hijab debate in India, you immediately have to look at the third, fourth, fifth, sixth opinion on it. And I'm going to take my cue from Zakia Soman, who also heads the Bharatiya Muslim Mahila Andolan, along with Nurjahan Safia Niaz, to say that, look, as Muslim women, we understand that the hijab, that Muslim girls have been forced into hijab, some of them, right? We understand that there are communities and families in which Muslim girls have been forced to wear the hijab. We also understand now that there's this context where they're being forced to remove the hijab. Both are wrong. It's perfectly fine and very necessary to nuance the issue. Both are wrong. They're both discrimination. They're both going to deny Muslim women of the right to education. First priority, access to education, no matter what she's wearing. And I think that is the core focus, right? And so it's perfectly okay to look at binaries and dismantle them, particularly in conversations around this. And I think as an ally, to give those opinions of Muslim women who are leading this dismantling would be the best way forward, in my opinion.
And change doesn't necessarily happen from a democratic government. You want to wait for a democratic government in our context,
Do it yourself kind of thing. Okay, so thank you very much. I think it was very important for us to have that chance to hear from you. Thank you. Yes, I already asked for Ghana if she wants to respond, and she said, no, you have done a great job. Thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Please stay in touch. And these are the websites you might want to check, and also the people you might want to talk with before you leave. Thank you very much.